Well, good morning, and can I welcome everyone to this, the 29th meeting of the Public Audit Committee in 2025. Agenda item 1 is for members of the committee to consider whether or not to take agenda items 4, 5, 6 and 7 this morning in private. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Thank you. Our second agenda item is consideration of the Audit Scotland report into improving care experience, delivering the promise. And I'm very pleased to welcome as our witnesses to the committee this morning Stephen Boyle, the Auditor General. And alongside the Auditor General this morning, he's joined by Mark McPherson, who is an Audit Director at Audit Scotland, Claire Tennyson, who is an Audit Manager at Audit Scotland, and we're also joined by Andrew Burns, who's the Deputy Chair of the Accounts Commission, because it is a joint report between Audit Scotland and the Accounts Commission. So, Andrew, you're very welcome. I'm going to start the proceedings by inviting the Auditor General to make a short opening statement, and then we'll get to our questions. Auditor General.
Many thanks indeed, Convener, and very good morning to the committee. As you mentioned, Convener, today is our joint report on delivering the promise, which is a joint report together with the Accounts Commission. As the committee may recall, in February of 2020, a commitment known as the promise was made to Scotland's children, young people and adults with care experience to transform within a 10-year period what is known as the care system. Today's report looks at the foundations for delivery and how these so far have supported change. Our report doesn't look at detailed progress in individual areas, but where relevant, we've highlighted the work and reporting that others have made on this subject so far. The commitment to deliver the promise from individuals, organisations, remains strong across both the public and third sectors. But a report found that initial planning about how the promise would be delivered did not provide a strong platform for success. If the promise is therefore to be delivered, greater pace and momentum is needed in the years up to 2030. In 2024, nearly 12,000 children and young people were formally recorded as having spent time in care, with many more people, including care-experienced adults, in receipt of services at some point in their lives. Behind every statistic, of course, is a person passing through the care system, and as our report highlights, their experiences should be at the heart of any interpretation of success. The Scottish Government's vision is that all children and young people will grow up feeling loved, safe and respected, and that they can realise their full potential. Our report underlines that the Scottish Government and COSLA did not adequately plan how this vision would be achieved or measured. A delayed promise progress framework was published in December of 2024, and that was developed in partnership with the Scottish Government, COSLA and the Promise Scotland. This is of course welcome, but in its current form it does not yet capture if care experienced people feel the impact of change and if their lives are getting better. This is a crucial next step. Our report also found that amongst multiple layers of governance, collective accountability for the promise remains challenging. New entities have been established to support delivery and oversight of the promise, but we consider there's been a lack of clarity about their roles and responsibilities. Those tasked with planning have sought to take a different approach to planning, but national plans require further detail for individual sectors on how the promise will be delivered. Our report found that the Scottish Government has not yet assessed the skills or resources needed to deliver the promise by 2030. We see this and have said in our report that this represents a significant delivery risk. The workforce remains dedicated to improving the lives of care-experienced people, but there are significant challenges around recruitment, retention and staff well-being, and these remain prominent. The Scottish Government and COSLA must work with their partners to identify where resources need to be targeted to deliver upon their objectives. We welcome the development of key pieces of work that are due by the end of next month, including the next iteration of the Promise Progress Framework and Plan 2430 supporting route maps. The content of these documents and how they are used will be crucial in determining how much can be delivered by 2030. Convener, as ever, between the four of us, we will do our utmost to answer the committee's questions this morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Can I begin by looking at the governance and accountability arrangements? Because your report draws attention to the extremely complex government arrangements that are in place surrounding the promise. I think you use expressions like they are challenging. The attempts so far to address this very complex governance landscape have, I think, again in your words, been insufficient. I wonder whether you could expand on that a little bit and give us your understanding of what those governance arrangements are, how they've come about, and what needs to be done to address them.
Yeah, very happy to start, Convener, and I'll certainly turn to colleagues if they wish to come in. I think maybe just perhaps to highlight key message 3 in today's report kind of sets out our overall thinking and judgment about governance. So there are many organisations who are tasked with delivering the promise. I think I may also actually refer to, if I may first of all, Convener, Exhibit 1 on page 9 of the report draws on the work of the Oversight Board themselves, and perhaps illustrates pictorially how many organisations are involved in the overall landscape of delivering the promise. So by its very nature, this is complicated. There's no question that first up. When we look at the governance then, we've said in the report there's a lack of clarity about roles and responsibilities in some of the decision-making framework. And there are many organisations who are tasked with delivery, but then also have oversight and supporting contributions itself. And we've said this remains confusing and not necessarily geared up to support the collective responsibility and accountability that is necessary. Again, to illustrate the point, Convener, if it's helpful, at Exhibit 3 on page 16 of the report, can we make reference to the key organisations involved in the process, the respective roles and responsibilities? And I think as we've reported through many parts of our work, governance matters. It's important that that's clear, accountability is clear, and roles and responsibilities are clear too. And in today's report, I sense that a consideration of whether or not the totality of these arrangements is delivering to best effect. So we make recommendations, as we do in our reports, Convener, about just consideration and clarification around the roles and responsibilities for the Scottish Government, COSLA, and the Promise Scotland of how governance will work to best effect really over the next 5 years to support the delivery of the objectives set out when the promise was supported back in 2000. Again, I'll pause. I think Andrew wants to come in, and then if Mark or Claire wish to add anything.
Thanks, Convener, and thanks, Stephen, for passing over to myself. Just to maybe amplify some of that, Convener, from a local perspective, just to sort of try and illustrate the complexity. I mean, just before the exhibit that the Auditor General drew attention to, Exhibit 3 on page 16, on page 15, there's a little bit of text about, I think it's paragraph 17, about the role of children's services planning partnerships at a local level, and they are the bodies, delivery bodies, represented and given voice by the Scottish Government with other corporate parents who are tasked with implementing the changes within the promise. And it's clear from the work that Audit Scotland officers, and Claire and Mark might want to come in to expand on this further in detail, have done, that whilst all the children's services planning partnerships have got delivery plans, all 30 of them have got a delivery plan that mentions the promise, only 15 of them actually have the promise as a priority. And those CSPPs, the Children's Services Planning Partnerships, report to the Community Planning Partnerships, which have a mixture of elected members and other local authority bodies on them. And it is, even without the overarching architecture of the promise, I know from experience, I know looking around the room, potentially some of you know from experience at a local level, it can be confusing at times, that responsibility and accountability at a local level through community planning partnerships. So, I mean, really just to emphasise the Auditor General's point, that lack of clarity and lack of emphasis on accountability really does weave its way through right from local to national government. And none of that really, I hope, comes across as saying that there's a lack of commitment to delivery of the promise, because right from local to national level, there is complete buy-in to delivery of the objectives of the promise, as the Auditor General said. But there is just a lack of clarity around roles and responsibilities that, as I've said, weaves its way right from local to national.
Yeah, I mean, it's mentioned in the report, isn't it, that there can be quite a wide variation from local authority to local authority. And I just wonder what's done to promote good practice and how much networking there is to elevate those examples where things have gone well and there have been, you know, more successful interventions and outcomes compared to other areas where there appears to have been fairly minimal activity. Andrew, I don't know whether you can...
You know, happy to come back on that, and colleagues might want to expand on it further. I mean, it's a good point, because the Auditor General referenced in his opening comments the route plan for 2430 and the draft route maps, which are supposed to be published by the end of this year, which is now a matter of weeks away. They will provide a potentially good route for CSPPs that I mentioned and other bodies to give evidence about what they're doing in terms of delivering on the aspirations of the promise. And our final recommendation, I think it's on page 7 of Audit Scotland's report, makes a specific point of recommending that the CSPPs pick up on those route maps in the delivery of the local plans that I just referenced. And I mentioned, and this echoes the point you just asked in your question, Convener, that whilst all 30 partnerships have got the promise referenced in their plans, only 15, half of them, have got it as a priority. And that could be improved by use of the soon-to-be-published route maps and within the context of the 2430 delivery plan. And so we are recommending that all CSPPs look at that carefully and do that within the next 12 months. I don't know if colleagues want to come in and expand on that.
Can I say one action? I'll be clear, and then Mark. So I think what we also found, Convener, is that the role of some sectors is much clearer than others. So Andrew mentions, you know, the principle of, you know, of the public sector is signed up to delivering the promise. You know, our audit work did not find any debate or dissent about people wishing for Scotland's care system to deliver better outcomes for people with care experience. And the roles and responsibilities of some sectors are more closely mapped to the contribution that they can make, particularly local authorities, social work departments and education departments. But it isn't just confined to local authorities. The role of delivering the promise extends across the public sector. And what we found, there were some parts that it was less clear how they would contribute to better outcomes, such as housing services, and particularly the NHS. And perhaps draw attention to paragraph 31, where I can make the point that in October of 2024, a promise NHS network was established. But it perhaps speaks to the wider point we make about some of the pace. That's 4 years or so after the commitment to deliver the promise. And actually, again, echoes, I think, much of the narrative of the need for the system to change and evolve. Effectively, this system is a hallmark of public service reform, to do things differently, potentially spend money differently alongside that, and that's part of the thinking of much of the work of the independent strategic advisor to the promise. But illustrative of the point that there's a lack of clarity for people of what they need to do. So there is much to come. We understand by the end of this year, as Andrew referenced, the route maps, to provide some of the clarity across multiple organisations about who can contribute best where. So some important next steps to try to recover some of the momentum in the years to come. But if you're content, Convener, maybe kind of keen to bring in Claire and then Mark.
Hi, good morning. Just to build on a couple of points that have been touched on already. So in Exhibit 3, as has been mentioned, we kind of capture some of the main governance groups in relation to the promise that have been kind of newly set up. So this covers oversight, policy planning and support and delivery. So that's the kind of the main groups that are in existence in relation to the promise specifically. There's also, we reference later in part 1 of the report, there's around 40 groups at least that have a kind of either direct or indirect role in relation to delivering the promise, which are kind of spread across more specific policy areas or broader themes such as equalities and human rights, etc. So the promise inherently just touches on so many different aspects of someone's life and through different services, which reflects in its complexity. Just on the point about sharing of learning and kind of good practice, there are kind of opportunities for bodies to do this. So in Exhibit 3, under policy planning and support, we refer to Children's Services Planning Partnerships. So there's the Strategic Leads Network for Children's Services Planning Partnerships. And in local government, there's a Local Government Programme Board. So this brings together professionals from these sectors, and this is kind of opportunity where learning can be shared. I think just more broadly, just on work to address governance, we reference at paragraph 38 of the report that the Promise Scotland has carried out some work on work to kind of improve and simplify the governance and accountability landscape. So this was published last year, and there's still kind of work to be done to take that forward. Yeah, I think that was all.
Thank you.
I'll try to be brief, Convener. I think it's worth starting by saying this is a national commitment. People across the country are bought into it, but it's obviously heavily reliant on local delivery. And we know that COSLA has published annually reports on the activity happening in local areas, and earlier this year the Promise Scotland published a local perspectives output that gave another indication of a list of activities. I think that one of the issues is that not all of that information is synthesised effectively to provide the national picture. And again, the national commitment is the key element here. We have seen evidence, as others have mentioned, of the development of the Promise Progress framework, the Promise Story of Progress, the route maps that are underway. All this activity has taken place in the last 12 to 18 months, and the promise was made in 2020. So I think there is something there about, as the Auditor General has referenced, the need for greater pace if delivery is going to be successful by 2030.
Thank you. I mean, I do note that one of your recommendations, which you are calling on the Scottish Government with support from the Promise Scotland to be completed within the next 6 months, so there's a degree of urgency to this, is a call for identifying, reviewing opportunities to streamline the remit status and expected impact of governance groups, boards and forums linked to the promise. So you've obviously identified that as being something which requires urgent attention.
Yeah, indeed. We think that, as I mentioned a moment or two ago, Convener, governance matters, but we should always challenge ourselves in coming to a view, is every step necessary to deliver effective governance, and striking the right balance. I think what we've got at the moment is a very complex system, and not perhaps leaping too far, but the challenge effectively that we wanted to make to government, COSLA and Promise Scotland, is that helping the delivery of the promise, or is there a risk that it in itself becomes a barrier of too many steps, too many layers, and not necessarily having the clarity to support the momentum and the pace that's needed between now and 2030?
Yeah, and Graham Simpson's going to come in with some questions in this area as well shortly. But I've got one more question before I bring Graham in, which is on a related area, but looking at it from a slightly different angle. In paragraph 20 of the report, you make the point that much of the Promise Scotland's aims are to support longer-term change. And on the other hand, the nature of these things is that there are often kind of short-term projects and short-term imperatives. So I guess the question that we've got as a Public Audit Committee is, and you identify that as a risk, is how is that risk being managed? And do you think there's a danger of some of those longer-term structural changes, which the intention is to deliver by, at the outside, 2030, which is less than 5 years away? Do you think that there is a danger that some of those longer-term structural changes may be blown off course by shorter-term imperatives?
I think that risk is undeniable. That there are many steps to be gone through between now and 2030, and as ever with these things, so short-term changes really matter. You know, the cumulative impact of those can lead to some of the system-wide change that was identified following the independent care review and then the commitment for the promise. But I think it's a remaining sense, convener, that there needs to be that close level scrutiny, clarity around roles and responsibilities. Some of the other fundamentals that I'm sure we'll talk about over the course of the evidence session about monitoring arrangements, funding arrangements too, all of these, that we hope that our report is of use to all of the people who remain committed to deliver it. But you're right that I think it's striking the right balance between the cumulative benefit of short-term changes and then that clarity around system-wide impact that will come by the end of the decade.
Okay, thank you. I am now going to invite Graham Simpson to put some questions to you. Graham.
Thanks very much, convener. Auditor General, when I've been reading your report and reading up on the promise, I'm still not quite clear in my head what the promise actually is. Are you clear on what it means?
I think there was clarity within the Parliament and with service users and recipients of service, people who've gone through Scotland's care system, that they wanted to produce a better outcome for people who were care experienced. So going back to the independent care review at the end of the last decade, that was said that the care system wasn't producing the kind of life chances, equalities that people wanted in Scotland. And as I think as colleagues have mentioned, that absolutely led to a universal recognition that Scotland wanted to keep the promise. And go back to, I mentioned in my opening remarks, that people who experience the care system in all its forms, it's a complex array of language actually, and I maybe ought to have said in my introductory remarks, convener, that language really matters in this report actually, and it can be sensitive and triggering, and so I'm conscious of that. But what we've sought to do in today's report was to take stock of progress towards delivering the promise by 2020. Where the governance arrangements, the measurement framework, how the spending to deliver that was on track across all of the objectives. I'll maybe bring colleagues in actually, but one point I wanted to make before doing so, Mr Simpson, is it about the measurement framework on delivery of the promise. That was not produced.
I'm going to come to that. So not everyone has to answer the question.
I appreciate that.
So my next question is, if our starting point is the care system needs to be improved, and let's put it this way, we will promise to improve it. That's the promise. What do we mean by that? So how do we measure that? What constitutes meeting the promise to improve the care system by 2030? So when we get to 2030, what needs to have happened?
So I think that goes to the heart of what we've kind of sought to draw out in today's report, that the clarity of objectives for delivery of the promise can mean different things to different people. So, but ultimately it is rooted in the experience of individuals, of whether they think that they have received better outcomes. And I go back to the language, because it really matters, that people have grown up feeling loved, safe and respected, and able to realise their full potential. So in today's report, we offer some examples of impact of change. So for example, changes to detention of 16 and 17-year-olds within the prison estate. That's cited as one of the impacts of change for the promise. That there are fewer people who are in residential care also. But it's complex, Mr Simpson. I think in that it's right to recognise that some of these indicators are indicative of change and success, but they're not necessarily able to translate entirely whether that was the right thing for people. Yeah. So I think, again, goes back to some of the things, the voices of people who are care experienced will perhaps be the most important to hear from, whether they believe that the system has changed appropriately from where it might have been in earlier periods in history. If you're content, I think Andrew, maybe first of all, would also like to come in on this point.
I mean, just briefly, thanks, Stephen. Graham, I think the very fact that you have to ask that question illustrates what part of the problem here is. I mean, I absolutely agree with everything the Auditor General's just said, obviously, about the centrality of care experience voices within all of this. And it's important to keep that in mind throughout our discussions this morning. In paragraphs 1 to 4, in the opening section of our report, try to say exactly what the promise is, but it is complicated, it's complex, and it's broken across a whole host of government bodies that we've already alluded to in the last sort of 10-15 minutes, and accountability is not clear. So I just make the point that the very fact you asked that question, I think, illustrates part of the issue that the Audit Scotland report is flagging up today. And I know we'll probably come on to this, Convener, but I think it's really crucial to say, just in case we don't, that the Audit Scotland Accounts Commission report's not saying anything different, I don't think, from what the Oversight Board have said in some of their latter reports. And I really just make that point to reinforce again that there's a commonality here about some of the messages that people who are auditing or overseeing this work are picking up on, and it is that lack of clarity and accountability and clear sightlines of who's responsible for what.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It's complicated. So it's just struck me that we could get to 2030 and, some parts of the system will have improved. Some people going through the system will say, oh, we've had a good experience. Others will not. So it just strikes me that when we get to 2030, it's actually going to be very difficult to say whether the promise, whatever that means to you, has been delivered. I'm just making that point. But it seems to be confusing for the various bodies tasked with delivering the promise, whatever that means, as well. That comes out in your report. That it seems to mean different things to different people or different bodies. Is that a fair summary?
I think it is. I think I've said similar in my last answer about the and again maybe just the start of section 2 of our report on page 24, really the kind of subheader, but it emphasises that from the outset the Scottish Government did not adequately plan how it would define, measure and monitor progress. And in some, you'll have seen, Mr Simpson, we produce reports from time to time that make a similar point about implementation is most likely guaranteed when these steps are in place. I would recognise that the ambitions of the promise are so wide-ranging and complicated that with there's some mitigation because of the complexity here, but nonetheless, I think, given where we are now in timescales, with the publication of the framework last year, and then it needs to build upon that. We've mentioned once or twice already this morning about planned route maps to give clarity to people who work in the sectors, to delivering about what people need to do. And there is that synergy that people want to do well, they want to deliver this promise, but they need help from government, from COSLA and from the Promise Scotland to help them do so.
Well, they have to know what it is they're meant to be doing. So is that the issue, that these various bodies don't actually know what it is they're meant to be doing to deliver on this commitment? And
I think you've heard evidence already from Andrew. But you want to come in again, Andrew, on the children's services planning partnerships, which are the entities that bring together the key players in delivering the promise. Notwithstanding the point about only around half of those have delivering the promise as a strategic priority, but if those organisations and the organisations they represent from the people around those tables haven't got clarity, it will be harder to evidence and deliver the promise over the remaining years. So, whether Andrew, you want to say more than that?
Really just to agree, there is a lack of uniformity in terms of the understanding and the reporting and the priority that's given to delivery at a local level. And that's why, I know we're in danger already of repeating ourselves, Convener, but that's why the importance of the route maps as part of the 2430 plan that we've referenced several times already are so crucial. And as Auditor General, and I think Mark said earlier, all that has just been instigated in the last 12 to 18 months. Is very welcome, but it would have been more effective if it had been there right at the outset when the care review's recommendations were made and the promise was adopted. But it's very positive that the route maps as part of the 2430 plan are now coming forward, as I think I said earlier on, by the end of this year.
Yeah, you did. We've mentioned the Oversight Board. We had correspondence from the chair of the Oversight Board, David Anderson. If I could just read a couple of excerpts from that and just say, tell me what you think. So, first one, progress to deliver the promise has been too slow, accountability remains unclear, and planning across government and partners has not yet been coordinated in a way that gives confidence that, given we're at the halfway mark, enough meaningful change is being achieved. And I assume from your report you'd agree with that.
Yes, I would. I think there's a parallels to what Mr Anderson has said relative to what we've set out in our own report.
Okay. Next one. He says, slow progress cannot be explained by complexity alone. We've heard it's complex. It reflects the absence of timely decision-making and clear ownership within government. When leadership hesitates, systems drift. The barrier is often not process, but people. We've seen decisions delayed, accountability avoided, and the urgency of lived experience overlooked. That's pretty strong stuff. What would your comment be on that?
So these are very clear views from the chair of the Oversight Board. What we look to do is recognising the consistency of those views with what we've set out in today's report, is with the recommendations that we make in the report. We hope that these are helpful to design to address some of the need for pace and momentum that remains within the years to come, whether it's about roles and responsibilities, governance, progress monitoring, how finance is organised, roles and responsibilities, workforce are all the relevant factors, Mr Simpson, to deliver it. But as ever, at the heart of that is that collective leadership. And there is an opportunity here because it's rare that there is such universal commitment. You know, we don't see that in all of our reports, that people want to deliver upon a national outcome of keeping the promise. The language remains that this is an objective, but there are steps that are needed to mitigate down the delivery risk that we refer to in the report.
Okay. I'll just put this final point to you. I'll just go that last comment that I read to you, where he says the barrier is often not process but people. Who do you think he's referring to? He says we've seen decisions delayed, accountability avoided, and the urgency of lived experience overlooked. So that suggests to me there's a systemic failure. But the comment about people, not process, is particularly strong. So it suggests that there are people in the system who are not doing what they should be doing.
So you probably expect me to say it's hard for me to second guess what Mr Anderson was, what or who he was referring to, and I'm sure he's best placed to speak for himself rather than me to overinterpret his commentary. But I think it really kind of goes back to where we've sought to, the Audit Scotland, myself and the Accounts Commission today, is to provide a stock take of the delivery of this national priority, this commitment. Even if we go back to some of, at the heart of it is people's experience of public services, together with significant amounts of public spending that's designed to improve outcomes, and whether that could be done better. And that's what we sought to do. Okay.
Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Graham, I'm now going to invite Colin Beattie to put some questions to you. Colin.
Thank you, Convener. Morning, General. I've got a couple of areas I'd like to explore. You've already touched on this question of care experienced people and their input. But page 22 of your report says that although there's examples of engagement with care experienced people, it's not always clear that their voice is actually being embedded into the service design. So, can you tell me a little bit more about that?
I'll maybe bring Claire in, actually can say a bit more about some of the work that we did in this area. And as the committee will see in the report, we produced some excerpts of some of the direct contributions that people made during the audit fieldwork. Claire might want to touch on some of that, and perhaps particularly the role of champion boards, which is some of the mechanism, one of the governance mechanisms about how to explore with care experienced people whether the system was changing, whether it was working along the way. So I'll pass to you, Claire, if you're happy to say that out.
Thank you, Auditor General. So, yeah, as you mentioned in paragraph 39, we're talking about how children, young people and care experienced adults' voices are considered as part of services. So I think, broadly speaking, the evidence on this is mixed. There's kind of various strands of research which we've considered within our findings here. So just in terms of, to pick up some examples, Auditor General mentioned the existence of champions boards, which exist in local areas and allow children and young people opportunity to express their views on specific matters in relation to the promise. So just I suppose a caveat on that champions boards may take other forms such as kind of local promise keepers or such like, but there's mixed findings from the engagement that's come through the champions board in terms of some people report examples of where they feel seen and heard, others kind of less so the case where their experiences and their desire for certain certain outcomes or certain services are kind of overruled by things like resources, or they might not be able to sustain relationships with the workforce due to recruitment barriers and so on. We've also considered other kind of national research from the Care Inspectorate, which has looked at transitions for children and young people moving on from care. And again, this was an area that highlighted that kind of destinations can often be dictated by resources. So I think there's certainly various areas where young people's voices are being sought and incorporated, but it's just how that's actually then taken forward. The Scottish Government has carried out 4 consultations which commissioned Bernardo's and Who Cares Scotland to support with, which is fed into the bill that's being considered at the moment. So that's another kind of example or a route of where the Scottish Government is working to understand the views of young people. But I think broadly speaking it is a mixed picture depending on, I suppose it goes back to that issue of the promise being very, very broad, and it depends on what specific area or service that you're looking at. People could report different things, and again, different experiences for different individuals. It's just such a subjective thing for each person.
You seem to be saying it's, if I'm not incorrect, that it's a bit random, the approach, that it's not systematic in terms of having a programme to engage on service delivery, service design. Would that be correct?
So I think in terms of, again, going back to the various number of bodies that exist, different organisations will have their own approaches to engaging with people with care experience. So I suppose that's one layer, but at a national level, the Promise Progress Framework, which we've touched on this morning, at the moment, how that is presented doesn't capture the experiences and outcomes for care experienced people. So the next iteration of this is due in December this year, and that will seek to assess if care experienced people are feeling the impact of change. So that would be that more kind of national collective piece in terms of how people are feeling that their lives are improving. But yeah, I would probably just bring it back to the point that yeah, there are just so many different organisations and sectors and services, so they'll all have their own routes into engaging with people.
So what we're referring to here is the national picture as opposed to the sort of ground level approach. But we don't actually know what these local institutions are doing in terms of reaching out to care experienced young people. Do we assume it's happening, or do we have evidence it's happening?
Corporate parents are kind of report on how they're supporting care experienced people at an organisation level, and they'll report on that within their individual reporting.
I think the action is going on locally to engage with young people, and you're right to say that it's bringing it back to this national picture of how is that working across the whole of the country. Claire has quite rightly referenced the next iteration of the Promise Progress Framework has been very important. We reference this in paragraph 60, at which point we say towards the end, 5 years on, this is overdue and is a significant risk to understanding progress. So actually getting young people's views and understanding how the changes that have taken place so far are affecting them is a critical bit that is missing at the moment. And so that's why we're emphasising the need for that work to be completed. Okay, thank you. I'll move on to another area you'll not be unfamiliar with, data collection. I don't know how many times we've talked about it in this committee, about the lack of data or the anomalies within the data collection system. Now, page 24 of the report says that available data is not sufficient to assess if services are improving the lives of care experienced people at a national level, but improvements are underway to enable long-standing data barriers to be addressed. Well, I suppose the first question is, what are these data barriers that are being addressed? And given the fact that data collection has been forever in front of this committee and has always been commented on, why is the government not learning from previous deficiencies?
So I'm happy to start on that point, and you're right. We have discussed the importance of data collection, use of data, information sharing arrangements many times through our audit reports with the committee. And we do highlight, and I'll turn to colleagues in a moment to kind of say a bit more about some of the specifics, but information sharing arrangements remains an issue in terms of organisations being able to prevent having to ask the same questions over and over again of people with care experience. So that is a factor. I think we also, perhaps to maybe paragraph 50 and the subsequent paragraphs, Mr Beattie, that there is a recognition that this needs to improve by the Scottish Government and their partners. So there's an example there of exploring data linkage, really, going to some of the early school records that can stay with people to track progress, as an example of some of the exploration of how that can kind of address the point of having to better data, more consistent identifier, without having to go back and ask the same questions over and over again. Also, some of the steps the government has taken about workshops and groups to establish how they can tackle this issue. On a more negative point, as you mentioned, that the importance of good data is not just a familiar issue for this committee, but really for government, and whether that ought to have been anticipated at an earlier stage. But I think what we are keen now is that there is momentum. The good data tracking and monitoring and evaluation is accelerated and is at the heart of this ambition now for the next 5 years. But again, I'll turn to Claire and Mark if there's anything they want to add.
Thank you. So just in terms of work that's underway to improve data, we've referenced some specific examples of work that's underway at paragraph 49 of the report. I suppose more broadly, just to say that improvements to data infrastructure does take time. It's not something, I suppose, that can be addressed really quickly, but it goes back to that point about planning at the start for the promise and how it would be measured. Just in terms of other work that's underway to address data, so the Promise Progress Framework, as I mentioned, the next iteration of that's due at the end of this year will capture the next 2 levels of the framework. So that will look at if care experienced people are feeling the impact of change, but it will also look at organisational level data. So this work, as I understand, is being supported by a data and evidence group at Scottish Government, and that's got it recently published a work plan kind of more towards the end of our audit work, I believe in August, and that set out at a high level some of these kind of projects that will support the various work streams there. But yeah, certainly completion of the overarching framework is a crucial next step, as we've set out in the report.
I sometimes despair of some of the terminology that's used in some of these reports. On page 27, you refer to longitudinal research and data triage. Perhaps can I have that in English?
Far be it for me to correct you, Mr. Beat. I think we refer to data linkage, if that's okay as well. But we've got hopefully helpful, and I'll bring colleagues in to say a bit more. But yeah, data linkage, and I think and forgive me if we have used some of the terminology that is prevalent in those that are working in the system, and particularly in this context, clarity of data, clarity of language, I should say, really matters. The data linkage, first of all, is really that simply is that the data follows the person, from organisation to organisation and over the course of their use of public services in this context through the system. But again, I think I'll maybe bring colleagues in actually can say a bit more about what the point we're trying to convey is that there is work underway to address the long-standing issue that data hasn't been strong enough to support some of the interventions, the decision-making that is necessary with such a system. Claire?
I suppose when you're answering, maybe you could comment on whether the work that's being done is sufficient to assess services and ensure that there is actually improvements taking place.
So just to build on what's been said, yeah, so the Auditor General set out the work around data linkage. So I suppose kind of data as it stands at the minute for care experience people only really is kind of primarily administrative data that looks at children or an adult at a point in time, rather than, as Auditor General's pointed out, kind of mapping together a person's journey through health, through education, social work, the justice setting, etc. I think what's come through our audit work is that there is actually a lot of information held in Scotland in relation to care experienced people. It's just about how that's used in a meaningful way. In terms of action to address these barriers, so we have highlighted some kind of work that's underway, but as I say, will take time for these to embed. And just going back to the progress framework, that's obviously taken a while to come into place, only been established last year and then requiring further development. So we do recognise that there has been a delay there.
In paragraph 55, the report says that Promise Scotland is leading the work to support improved data collection, but that progress has been slower than planned. And I think that relates to 2 projects to support better use of data and identify resolutions in data sharing. Can you say a bit more about the work that Promise Scotland is doing in connection with that? How is it supporting the improved data, and why is progress slower than anticipated?
So I'm happy to say what I think Claire can come in on some of the detail of the 2 projects. I maybe echo the language Claire referenced. It is complex. I think that there are multiple systems that will capture people's experience of traversing through the care system in the earlier stages of their life, whether it's education, social work, housing, health systems, and so forth. So bringing all of that together is complicated. The complexity that's been exposed, whether you could take a view, well, that would have been known in advance, and whether that's appropriate mitigation for some of the time that it's taken. I think that's probably more a matter for the different parts of the system and the Promise Scotland to express a view on. I think what we're pleased to see is that there is work underway, because back to some of our earlier commentary, Mr. Beattie, about the timing and the momentum is really matters now to support delivery over the next 5 years. But again, Claire might want to say a bit more about the information sharing project and then the data map that Promise are developing.
Thank you. So we've already touched on the challenges around information sharing. So this project is being led by the Promise Scotland in collaboration with Scottish Government and launched last year. So that project is expected to publish in December 2025, and this is looking at how to address key barriers in information sharing across kind of thematic areas around legal, cultural and technical issues. So it's looking at kind of culture around leadership, around data sharing, and around practice around risk in relation to data sharing. So that's expected to publish next month. The second project we mentioned has been ongoing for a bit longer, and that's the Promise Data Map. So this was one of the Promise Scotland's kind of earlier projects when it was established. So I don't know if we're entirely clear what that will look like. It has been delayed because the project has evolved in terms of its initial purpose. The initial assumption was that it would allow organisations to know what data they collected and kind of map that across Scotland. But the project is now going to focus more on a kind of quality improvement tool. And it has been tested in South Ayrshire with some positive feedback. As I say, I think in practice we haven't seen kind of how that tool will look like, how it will function. And that again is due for completion at the end of 2025.
Mr. Beattie, I think Andrew wants to come on this point as well.
No, thanks, Auditor General. Colin, I just wanted to add, I think you're right to flag up the importance of this, and hopefully the answers from Claire and others have illustrated that it has been taken very seriously within the report, and you've referenced the fact that the Promise Scotland as an entity are potentially leading on much of this. And I just wanted to reference back to, I think you referred to yourself, Convener, in some of your opening comments, our recommendation number 1 at the top of the report. In the next 6 months, Scottish Government COSLA, with support from the Promise Scotland, should, and there's 4 or 5 bullet points. And the last bullet point that we make a recommendation around is on this very specific issue about the coordination of data via the newly established Data and Evidence Group. So I guess I'm just reinforcing and hopefully making the point that we collectively hope that all the bodies referenced in that recommendation 1 do pick up on that promptly within the next 6 months and collate and codify the data in a much more uniform manner that makes delivery of progress more understandable for members of the public and for those people who are scrutinising what's happening with the delivery of the promise more globally.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm now going to turn to Joe Fitzpatrick to put some questions to you. Joe.
Thank you very much, Convener. Before I go to my questions around resources, I was wanting to pick up on a point made during the contribution from my colleague Graham, who was talking about we were talking about the complexity of understanding if the promises delivered, and he also read the quote about the urgency of the lived experience, and it kind of made me think, well, yeah, it's difficult to know when we've got this right, but it's absolutely clear when we've got it wrong, isn't it? So I guess one of my questions on that would be, when a care experienced person's journey is not what it should be, are we putting the urgency on that to first of all fix that for that person within the context of the promise, and are we looking at how do we make sure that doesn't happen to somebody else? Because when I've come across a care experienced person who's not had a great journey, the first thing I've said to them is thank you so much for speaking up, because it's not just about you, it's about all the other folk that are likely to be experiencing because the system's not working as it should be. Are we managing to join those dots?
I think that's such an important contribution that it's the system that needs to change rather than the individuals that can provide the better outcomes for people's experience at the earlier stages of their life, because it affects the totality of life chances thereon. And the learning that comes from that has to be reflected both in the local level through the different organisations that are working, and then gathered up by government, Promise Scotland and COSLA to share that, because ultimately that was the intention, that the Scotland would produce a better system and give people who are going through that system, going back to the language Mr Fitzpatrick loves, safe and respected, to deliver their full potential. That's why this really matters, of course.
Okay, thank you.
Echo that, Joe. I think what you've asked is at the heart of really what this is all about. I mean, the promise is about delivering on just that, giving voice to those care experienced people and making sure they're loved, safe and respected over the course of their journey through the care, their care, time in care. You know, if what comes out of the Audit Scotland Accounts Commission report, the work that I've already referenced from the Oversight Board, which have got very, very strong commonalities, does help the next stage of the delivery of the promise, the 25 to 30, then I think that will be a very, very welcome step, because we've referenced it several times. There's not a lack of commitment at all the different levels to delivering on these aspirations. They're commendable aspirations, but we are collectively struggling to see delivery on the ground. And following through these recommendations, listening to what the Oversight Board have said, and I think the 3 reports, particularly the last one, report number 3, and acting on those recommendations would make a huge difference to the success of delivery by 2030.
Okay, thank you. I'll move on then to resources. So key message 5 talks about the challenges of getting a clear assessment of what is required in terms of resources and skills. But you also, in the report, talk about how local government spending has gone up, Scottish Government funding for the promise has increased, but the report highlights the challenges of understanding how that funding is being allocated. It's obviously complex, where the money is going, how it's being spent. You particularly highlight the challenges on page 32 of the report of where there's differences in local systems. So where children's services, you've suggested, are part of the IGB, then it's more difficult to get clarity. And I guess we need to add into that the NHS's contribution as well. And so how do we understand how the money is managing to flow if we've got all these different systems? And how can we, while respecting that different areas will want to do things differently, and that's I think really important in terms of local democracy, how can we get some consistency of understanding of how the money is spending to make sure that the funding that has been allocated is being used, and so we can monitor that?
So you're absolutely right, and I think we thought really carefully about the language that we use around resources, because there are so many organisations involved in this. I think what we specifically refer to is identify the resources to deliver the promise, that they are targeted to deliver the objectives. And that won't necessarily mean that the system will continue to function as intended. The independent strategic advisor has done analysis of some of this, and I'm paraphrasing Mr Fitzpatrick, but really a language of perhaps changing how we spend money within the system, of investing and then disinvesting in different places as the system evolves. So we make a recommendation really for the Scottish Government COSLA and for the promise over the next 6 months to be clear on what actions, where resources will be spent to target delivery, to identify any gaps nationally, locally in funding resources and skills to deliver upon the promise. And I think that can be done respecting, as you say, that there'll be different priorities in different areas. Andrew might want to come and say a bit more about, our colleagues too, about some of the local component of that, recognising that there is complexity, no doubt, about some of the structures of IJBs, children's service planning partnerships, and how all of that money is spent and then collated. But we think it's such a key next step that it's our primary recommendation in today's report.
It is getting that balance right, because I think you referenced it in your question, Joe, and Auditor General referenced it as well, that there's nothing wrong with diversity of approaches, diversity of funding. That in many ways that's to be welcomed at a local level. Let 1,000 flowers bloom and so on. But to deliver a national, as I think Mark and Claire have both referenced this, that a national programme, it does need some direction, and it's getting the balance between that national direction and allowing local flexibility. But as Auditor General has referenced, and I think I said in my opening sort of response to the convener's questions, I mean, there is a very, very significant variation at the local level, which probably could be improved on, and that's certainly one of the strong recommendations within our report. It comes across in the work of the Oversight Board as well. And without repeating what we've gone over, the Children's Services Planning Partnerships, only half of them have the promise as a priority, and how the whole Family Wellbeing Fund is being expended has not been assessed in detail as of yet. It's early days, but just making progress on some of those elements would hopefully still allow local diversity, but bring a national focus to what is a very, very important programme of delivery, which, again, as the convener referenced right at the start, is now less than 5 years away from potentially being achieved. That was the initial target by the end of 2030.
I think it's really good that there are some really short target timescales for some of the targets. I think that's really good. I mean, I guess identifying the children's services which don't have the promise as a priority and making sure they do is a responsibility for all of us on the committee. I think the promise isn't just about government; it's about all of society. So as MSPs, I guess we just need to check that our children's services are including the promise as a priority as it should be, and encourage them to do so if not. Obviously, funding is always going to be a challenge. I think you've mentioned this is more than just about funding, though resources are wider than that. So there are some suggestions of local partnerships where that redirection of resources into more preventative spending, so you can actually get an improved outcome, improving the care experience without necessarily detrimenting other parts of the system by changing the way we do things. So it'd be good if there are any particular examples you'd like to flag, particularly for folk listening in, of where that's happened and happened worse, because it happened and worked well. Because I guess folk listening would be concerned that if you're going to spend money here, then that means that other areas will it would be to the detriment of other areas, but obviously that's not always the case if we get it right. It's not easy, I know that, so it'd be good to kind of hear where there's examples of good practice.
Thank you. Very happy to start on that. Colleagues might want to come into some of the detail of the particular areas across Scotland that we reference. So, whether it's in Glasgow, Perth and Kinross and elsewhere, we can set that out for the committee and anyone else watching today's session. If I may say a word or two, first of all, I think you referenced it yourself, Mr Fitzpatrick, about prevention and system reform is really what this is about. There are many strong examples of where spending differently, preventative spend, leads to better outcomes and at a lower cost. So some of the analysis that particularly was done by the Promise Scotland in terms of following the money, looking to kind of look at the multiple systems in place and how that money can be redirected to a preventative approach is again at the heart of some of the ambitions of the Promise. But again, I won't steal colleagues' thunder. Actually, I don't know if Claire, if you want to start with some of that.
Thank you. So we do reference two examples in part 3 of the report. So at paragraph 69 and 70, Perth and Kinross, which has had a programme of work since actually before the Promise in 2019, and that's supported preventing people at high risk of being accommodated away from home and keeping them in the community. Similarly, in Glasgow, they've got a long-standing programme around providing intensive support to vulnerable families and taking a different approach to how the service approaches risk and involving families more early on to prevent crisis intervention. I suppose kind of more broadly, later in the report, we talk about the whole family wellbeing fund. So that's a core funding stream that's been set up to support early intervention and prevention. And although there's been many challenges with that, I think from what we've heard through others at work, in areas where there's been kind of strong existing infrastructure in terms of strong supporting data systems. So some of the issues we've talked about this morning around kind of data sharing between different services, as well as long-standing relationships with the third sector, have been greatly valued in terms of being able to deliver those local supports. And we refer to the importance and the value of the third sector later in the report as well. So these are just some of the key kind of enablers.
And do we think that where good practice, you can see good practice, is that being shared? Are other areas looking on, or is there still a, well, that's Glasgow, so we're not going to do that? Or have we managed to break that down to actually put the folk that this is about at the heart of decision making?
So there are some good examples of sharing of learning. So for the Whole Family Wellbeing Fund, which I referenced, the Scottish Government have established a Learning in Action network, which brings together local whole family wellbeing support leads for opportunities to discuss their projects, discuss what's going well and the challenges. And we've thought the approach around the kind of sharing of learning has been robust in that respect. And as well, there are kind of in some of the national progress reports, for example, COSLA reports on kind of work that's underway locally to share learning, so that there is kind of different forums for this.
I referenced earlier, Mr Fitzpatrick, about some of the analysis and work done about investment and disinvestment led by the independent strategic advisor to, with a focus on, changing how money is spent to lead to anticipated better preventative outcomes. I think it's maybe worth also highlighting for the committee on that those theories remain as such, and I think, as we note in paragraph 72, the Scottish Government hasn't yet signalled its intention to absorb that thinking and that work about the timing of or pace of investment and disinvestment in systems. I think what we're keen to kind of see through the response to the report, whether that's going to be part of the system of change to think about how the multiple different ways that spending contributes towards delivering the promise, is that going to be part of it or not? So something we will continue to follow after today's report.
Okay, thank you. I think other colleagues have more questions in this area, so I'll leave it there.
That's great, Jill. Thank you very much. Yes, I'm going to invite the Deputy Convener, Jamie Green, to put some questions to you on this and some other areas. Jamie.
Thanks, Convener. And good morning, Auditor General and guests. Can I start with just a fundamental question? It's an issue that was raised earlier about the promise as a concept. Obviously, and this is mentioned in your report, is the Scottish Government has quite a clear and well-known and well-defined policy of getting it right for every child, commonly referred to as GIRFEC. If every public agency that GIRFEC is applicable to was getting it right for every child, would we need the promise at all?
I guess it's hard to be definitive on that. I think probably there's more a pragmatic sense that the outcomes for all children and young people going through Scotland's care system, people who were care experienced, weren't getting the outcomes that Scotland wanted for them. So where there was clear disparity in life chances having gone through the care system. So whether it applies to GIRFEC or the role that the multiple services involved, NHS, housing, education, social work, really goes back to the roots of why the Independent Care Review was commissioned, its report, and then the adoption by, not just by government, I should say, really by the Parliament and by public bodies to deliver better outcomes. So I think a recognition that the system, the legislation, wasn't working as intended and therefore needed an intervention and accompanying that, the objective across this decade to deliver the promise. So I think you could quite reasonably, as you've done, Deputy Convener, say, but GIRFEC and the various strands of legislation that that reference that and other objectives weren't working as intended and wanted to improve this system.
The reason I asked that is that there's an interesting quote on page 22 of your report which is from a Children's Services staff member, someone who's in the delivery of the promise, I assume, and they're unnamed, but you've quoted them as saying, does GIRFEX sit above the promise, or does the promise provide a framework in which GIRFEX sits presumably under? And I wondered if you had a view on what the answer to that question is.
I think what we've sought to do is illustrate through that quote and other parts of the report that there's a lack of clarity of what was intended and the importance, really within the next few weeks, of the Plan 2430 that takes us to the end of the current timescales. What individual organisations, the people who remain committed to delivering the promise, what's expected of them? And so I think it's a good example, Hope, of people wanting to do their best but not quite having the tools or levers or path themselves to do so.
I mean, does that not strike you perhaps as unusual so far into a policy? I mean, obviously the promise is a high-profile commitment. It was made by the former First Minister as a top priority, and rightly so. Nearly 6 years ago, so we're less than 4 years away from the completion date of the so-called promise. So, but yet to read a report out just a few weeks ago with some of the issues that have been highlighted in today's session, lack of clarity, lack of accountability, lack of following the money, and I'm going to come on to some of those issues. So far into the delivery of the policy, I mean, it strikes me as for something that has such attention given to it, is unusual or not?
I think certainly there's been a lack of momentum to deliver upon the shared ambition to deliver the promise. I think what we've sought to explore in the audit report is some of the reasons for that, about lack of clarity in roles and responsibilities. If I develop further, I think everybody can sign up. Who wouldn't sign up to delivering better outcomes for people going through Scotland's care system? But people need to be given the route map through to that, what that individual organisations, what's expected of them, where the money's going to be spent, the views of people, as we've touched on, Mr. Beattie, about of care experienced people, how are they receiving the system? So it's not just people who work in it or those charged with governance who oversee it, but it captures their view of the system as well. It is complex. I think, and I know that's been touched on a number of times this morning, the system is complex, but we knew the system was complicated. And I think it's clarity of direction, measurement framework, good quality data, resolving the funding arrangements, which you may want to touch on further, Deputy Convener, are all parts of how the system needs to evolve quicker than it has done in order to deliver the promise over the next few years.
It sure is complex. I mean, your table, Exhibit 8, talking about the workforce, which again is something else I'll chat to in a moment. I was quite struck by the graphic that shows that somebody working in the social care or the care sector is facing 60 different pieces of legislation and policies, sometimes competing with each other. I mean, for somebody who's on the front line dealing with perhaps very difficult situations, that is complex. That's a complex navigating landscape to get through simply to do your day job. I suppose that's testament to that. It's perhaps a statement rather than a question to the Auditor General. But let me talk specifically. You go into great detail about the Whole Family Wellbeing Fund. I'll refer to it as WFWF. What's the situation there? So back about 4 or 5 years ago, the government announced £500 million, £500 million dedicated to a presumed delivery of the promise. Now that's a substantial amount of money. Your terminology is you say the Scottish Government introduced £500 million. Now I don't know what introduced means. Does that mean they spent, they made available, they delivered? But in the next paragraph you go on to say that to date, only £148 million of that has been committed in budgets or is visible in budgets. So there's £352 million that simply hasn't been spent or doesn't exist. Do we know why?
So try and cover as many of those points as I can. So in terms of some of the timeline around this in 21-22, as we mentioned, but for no particular emphasis, were introduced. That was when the fund was created, to kind of really three distinct elements across local and national government, and the money allocated in terms of, as the committee, we're familiar with some of the ways that funding is, in terms of various factors, rurality and deprivation being one of those. 500 million to be spent over parliamentary term, and as you highlight and we mentioned in the report, only 148 million of that money has been spent to date. What we look to do is to kind of to say, well, that there'll become decision points about that for Parliament, really about what happens to that commitment after the Scottish Parliament elections will be a factor. But really, one being about pace, about why is the money not being spent as quickly as intended? About is the system not working as intended? Is there availability of recipients of that funding to support its overall objectives? We do say that, and I think it's important to emphasise that at the top of paragraph 86, there is a fairly robust approach for guidance and monitoring and sharing of the learning of the Whole Family Wellbeing Fund. And at some point, at the right point, it will need to be evaluated also. Did the money, with the totality of this system, did it deliver as intended? But that will need to come, and I suspect won't happen now till after the end of this parliamentary session, Deputy Convener. But again, I'll pause if Claire, Mark or Andrew wish to say anything more on this.
So just in terms of the Whole Family Wellbeing Fund, Auditor General's set out the three elements that make up the fund. So in terms of the 21-22, that it was introduced in the 21-22 programme for government, and then it's been committed since 2022-23. So you'll see from Exhibit 7, the most kind of substantial proportion of the funding is for Element 1, which is split between Children's Services Planning Partnerships and allocated via local authorities in collaboration with partners. So what we've heard through our audit work is many of the challenges have been for local areas to actually utilise the funding due to it being a short-term pot of money. And this has led to challenges in terms of filling posts associated with the fund's projects. And I mentioned earlier on just around existing infrastructure, so areas where there was maybe kind of long-standing challenges around, for example, data sharing, or if there's less well-developed connections with third sector partners who have also been key here. That's where there has been kind of risks, and similar for the Element 3 funding, again, the short-term funding, as well as kind of finding locations to deliver the support. I would just kind of reference the Scottish Government has set out its investment approach. We reference this at paragraph 85 for distributing the remainder of the fund, which will, as you mentioned, will go beyond this parliamentary term.
But I mean, I guess sort of the point, it looks to me like Element 1 seems to take up the lion's share of that funding due to the nature of where it's going. But I'm trying to get my head around, is it that the government announced that this money would be available, but the CSPPs didn't put in bids for money, that bids were put in but rejected, or the money was just simply never made available to them in their block grants, or in terms of, ring-fence funding that was there for them to spend. So is it because the government never gave them the cash, or there was no appetite to actually go and use it for specific projects? I know it had specific remits. And understanding that, I think, is quite key, because we may therefore know where the fault lines are in terms of why this money is not coming out of the system when it was promised to.
So the money was allocated to CSPPs via kind of a funding formula which takes into account factors like deprivation, rurality, etc. So the money kind of went out to CSPPs, but they've reported back challenges in using the funding. So I think we reference in this section that actual spending has also been lower. However, one thing that has been valued in relation to the funding is the ability to kind of roll that forward into future years. So that kind of local flexibility. I
would maybe also just draw the committee's attention to paragraph 83. So what we haven't really been able to establish is how the £500 million sum for the whole family wellbeing fund was arrived at. So that's not to say that it's not the right figure, but through our audit work, no real sense of the foundation for arriving at 500 million, what was necessary to deliver upon the three pillars within the fund.
Mm-hmm. These are presumably questions for ministers that we can rightly ask in our own way, so and will do so, particularly if that funding was for the course of this session of Parliament, which ends in 6 months. So there's no guarantees that that £350 million will be available to future governments, future parliaments. So that's a worry and concern. Linked to that, I suppose, is the issue of resource, people. And the report makes excellent work of highlighting some of the challenges that face the workforce, particularly in social care and the care sector. And the two statistics which jump out at me that are of the most worry, because we need people to deliver some of these services, is a 10% vacancy rate for social workers. I don't know if that's good, bad or indifferent in terms of the bigger picture, in terms of health and social care. But more importantly, that around a similar amount, 13% of social workers are very likely to leave the job in the next 12 months. So not maybe, not considering it, they're a bit stressed, they're a bit overworked. They've clearly been questioned by either their employers, by unions or third parties, and are very likely to leave. So we have to assume that's a fairly accurate figure. Where did you get these numbers from, and how concerning are they?
So I'll bring the team in to say a bit more about the methodology for the assessment. What I maybe say, I share your assessment. I think that these are concerns for the profession, for government, and ultimately delivery of the promise. What is welcome, therefore, is some of the response to this about what is the workforce planning, the pipeline of talent coming into the profession, and just note some of the steps that we set out in paragraph 93 that the Scottish Government and the Scottish Social Services Council are taking to encourage this as a profession, with graduate apprenticeships, revisions to training framework, Deputy Convener, that may help go some way to address it, but it's clearly a matter of significance. Yes, social work profession also matter, but I think also really just talking, the delivery of the promise, a key role for people who aren't professionals in that system, whether it's kinship carers, fostering services too, and just some of the statistics that we also draw out at Exhibit 8, that the team can come in and say a bit more about some of the challenges that they're experiencing. 49%, for example, of foster carers referenced that they experience burnout or poor well-being. So there are challenges absolutely in the system, and I think if I may reference again some of the recommendation in today's report about that resources, financial, workforce are absolutely targeted where it can make the most significant impact over the next 5 years. But again, Claire might want to say a bit more about some of the methodology that we adopted in this part of the report.
Thank you. So the stats referenced in Exhibit 8 are drawn from a range of sources. So the one that you mentioned around kind of wellbeing is from the Scottish Social Services Council report on wellbeing, and they report a lot of wider data for the social work profession. And within this exhibit, more broadly, there's information from the Fostering Network, which is an independent organisation. And the Scottish Government also produces some stats that are contained in this exhibit. So they're from some different sources.
Thank you. Yeah, they're very concerning. I would be concerned about any public sector area where 4 in 10 people feel unsafe at work, in their place of work. I think that's a shocking statistic. And it's no wonder. I'm surprised only 13% are considering leaving the profession in those circumstances. That number would normally be a lot higher in any other sector, any other business. So, but these people clearly are very passionate and in love with what they do and don't want to give up. But that's a real concern. So I guess I could maybe sum all this up, given the intensive work that the Audit Commission and Audit Scotland have done in this report and highlighting these issues, which I think received a huge amount of media coverage over the last month or so, rightly so, due to the level of work that you put into this. But based on your sort of professional judgment, would it be Audit Scotland's position that by 2030 the promise will be delivered? Or is there a risk that the promise will be broken for some or all of these care experienced young people?
It draws attention to the need for more pace, momentum, if the promise is to be delivered by 2030. Taking the appropriate steps around resources, workforce, clarity around roles and responsibilities, together with a targeting of funding in order to give the opportunity to meet the promise by 2030 as was intended. I think it would be premature, Deputy Convener, to be definitive one way or the other. 5 years is a long time. That can and systems can change and evolve far quicker than that with the right intent. So I don't think it would be wise to be definitive one way or the other with so many years to go.
Is this an issue you might revisit in coming years to follow track progress, do you think?
I think we'll certainly track progress with our recommendations, actually, and it's something I'm quite sure the Accounts Commission and I will, and indeed perhaps my successor, will factor into programmes of work that Audit Scotland will take forward.
Thank you, Auditor General. Thank you, Appreciate it.
Okay, thank you. Graham Simpson's indicated he wants to come back in with a very quick question. Graham.
Yeah, it's directed at you, Andrew. You said earlier that 15 children's services planning partnerships have the promise as a priority. So that leaves a number that don't. Do you have a list of those that don't that you could provide to us, even in writing? Yeah. And do you know why they don't have it as a priority?
Yeah. The straight answer, Graham, is no. I don't have that list at my fingertips. I don't know if colleagues Claire or Mark can help me out here if we do have that data, but I don't have it available right at this moment, no.
I think we can certainly write to the committee with some of that detail.
Okay.
But just to confirm, it is 15 that have got it as a priority and 15 who don't have it as a priority.
But you know which 15 it is then that do?
We don't have that detail, so our audit work's been at a kind of national level, and we have utilised existing reviews. So the Scottish Government monitors the children's services plans, and they've published a review, so we could obtain that information.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, if you could have a look at that, and if you can get back to us in writing, that would be helpful. Just, I've got one final question as well, and it picks up the theme of 15, but it's paragraph 15 from your report, which I thought was made for quite interesting reading, because you're describing how in 2020 an independent strategic advisor is appointed, presumably by the Scottish Government. In 2021, the following year, an oversight board is established, and that independent strategic advisor is made the chair of that oversight board. In 2022, they are asked to step down as the chair, and it takes them over a year for that process to be completed. When they don't fully step down, they become the co-chair, and somebody else is appointed as a co-chair. You describe that in very diplomatic terms, Auditor General, but it does look like a very messy situation. It also conjures up questions about that thing about clarity of roles and responsibilities. I mean, is the independent strategic advisor an advisor to the government, an advisor to the oversight board, an advisor to the Promise Scotland? And why was the decision taken? It wasn't appropriate for the person that held that role to continue as the chair of the oversight board, and why was there clearly some resistance to that from some quarters?
Yeah, so a few questions there, Convener. I think overarching, I think it speaks to the lack of clarity around roles and responsibilities that we referenced throughout the report, and the need for consideration as to whether the governance structures are helping or hindering the delivery of the promise. In terms of some of the specifics, again, I maybe don't have the insight that you're looking for in terms of whether there was resistance or otherwise. But in terms of reporting lines are two ministers, the strategic advisor, two ministers on the delivery of the promise is the fundamental of the role of the independent strategic advisor, who I'm quite sure would be, able to say more themselves about some of the specifics of their work. But if you look at the various roles and responsibilities, of which there are many, whether it's the Oversight Board, the role of government, that of COSLA, multiple public bodies that are involved here, together with the Promise Scotland, its officials, a separate team within the Scottish Government supporting the work of the delivery of the Promise, we think that it's right that there's a bit of a pause to say, is this system working as intended, so that people who are on the front line tasked with delivering the Promise have the right level of support and clarity of how to deliver their work.
Okay, good. Well, that's a nice bookend, because we finish as we started, looking at those governance arrangements. And can I thank you very much indeed for the evidence that you've provided for the committee this morning. Auditor General, can I thank you? Can I thank Mark McPherson and Claire Tennyson from Audit Scotland? And can I thank Andrew Burns, who's here from the Accounts Commission, for your evidence? You've undertaken to have a look at some of our requests for a bit more data. If you can supply us with that, we would very much appreciate that, because we'll need to consider what our next steps are in reviewing the findings that are contained in the report and the recommendations that you make. We've got a further evidence session, but to allow for a change of witnesses, I'm going to suspend this morning's meeting, and we'll resume in the next 5 minutes or so. Thank you. Well, can I welcome everybody back to this morning's meeting of the Public Audit Committee. I'm very pleased to say that agenda item 3 is further consideration of the Auditor General's report into adult disability payment. And I'm particularly pleased to be able to welcome to the committee this morning Adele Harris, who's the former chair of the independent review on adult disability payment. Adele, you're very welcome. Thank you for joining us at the committee this morning. It's greatly appreciated. We've got some questions to put to you, Adele, but before we get to those, I'm going to invite you to make a short opening statement to get us underway. Over to you.
Thank you, and good morning, committee. Apologies, first of all, for not being with you in person, but thank you for accommodating my attendance via Zoom today. The publication of the report, my report, in July this year marked quite a significant milestone in the ongoing efforts to assess and enhance the effectiveness of adult disability payment in meeting the needs of disabled people in Scotland. The independence of the review was welcomed, and my goal from the outset had been to ensure that the ADP system is fair, transparent and supportive, and that it empowers those that it serves to live with dignity and to enhance their independence. Now, since the transition from a reserve system of social security to one led and managed by the Scottish Government, there are obvious several welcome and positive changes which are really evident when you compare the Scottish system to the Personal Independence Payment PIP process. Therefore, my recommendations are first and foremost designed to build on those great foundations. In addition, they're designed to improve the overall client experience and to promote more timely decision making. But in my opinion, most importantly, the final set of recommendations are designed to ensure that we have a modern, outcomes focused and much more realistic approach to determining eligibility. It's worth highlighting in this short opening statement that many people throughout the course of the review gave very positive feedback about adult disability payment and Social Security Scotland. They spoke highly of staff interactions and they described feeling respected during the application process, and they welcomed in particular the lack of medical assessments and the short-term assistance that's on offer in Scotland, which is unique to Scotland. I heard the word kindness often, and I witnessed firsthand on my visits to the agency the culture and the values at the heart of Social Security Scotland. Within my recommendations, the proposed changes to systems and policies, this includes things like updated guidance and training, for example, may be more readily achieved in the near term. Some recommendations come with a one-off cost, whereas others, especially those that relate to changes or potential changes to eligibility, will likely involve ongoing costs. But estimating the change in benefit expenditures, I'm sure you can understand, is really challenging. Alongside the data that would be required and the assumptions that would be needed to make these robust calculations, there may also be some resulting behavioural changes by clients. So it may take a period of time for any changes in trends to become established enough for any costing analysis to be completed. And producing estimates of the scale of the impact on expenditure might be more straightforward, where some of my recommendations relate to specific cohorts of people, and in the report you'll see some illustrative examples. I'd really like to say and stress that this whole exercise only considers the potential costs, extra costs of making changes, and no work has been done or even been proposed on the potential wider benefits to the economy or to other state-funded services of making an investment in the people of Scotland. In an ideal world, decisions about eligibility would always be made on a human rights basis rather than being led by cost considerations. However, I do recognise the rising numbers and the gap between expenditure and block grant funding and the other financial limitations facing the government. If social security is indeed viewed as an investment in the people of Scotland and a human right, as outlined in the Charter and in legislation, then I hope ministers will use the findings of my review to design a truly world-leading disability payment system that is fair and supportive of disabled people's needs now and in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that opening statement. We took evidence back on the 1st of October from the Auditor General and his team, and he said some interesting things about where things were and what the government's response was to your review and your recommendations. And we're going to get into questions about that as well as costings, because we think, as you do, even though we're a public audit committee, we're not simply concerned about the financial cost implications of the system. We want to look at how it's been run and whether it's producing the outcomes which are intended. So I'm going to begin by inviting Joe Fitzpatrick to put some questions to you, Adele. Joe.
Thanks, Convener. Morning, Adele.
Morning.
I think you've maybe answered some of this question, but it'd be good just to get the background for what it was that spurred the independent review, why it came about, particularly as an independent review. What was the remit? I think you maybe have partly answered that, but maybe if you just give us a bit of detail about the remit and some information on how you went about carrying out your work.
Yeah, very happy to. Well, the Cabinet Secretary for Social Justice appointed me to chair the independent review in January 2024. Work began on the review in February 2024, and as you know, the report was published in July 2025. There was also an interim report that was published on the 5th of November 2024. The review took into account the analysis of the consultation on the eligibility criteria for the mobility component of ADP that predates me. That was published in August 2023, and also the analysis of the consultation and call for evidence for the daily living component of adult disability payment that was part of my review, and that was published in June 2024. So lots of reports. The government asked me to look specifically at the activities and the descriptors, by other terminology, the eligibility criteria, that determine someone's entitlement to ADP, and particularly how these apply to disabled people who live with fluctuating conditions. They asked me to assess people's experiences of applying for, receiving or challenging a decision about ADP or undergoing a review, and this included the experiences of people who were unsuccessful in their application. They asked me to look at the consultation process and the specific guidance for practitioners and the guidance for decision makers to ensure that a rights-based model of social security is being applied. And they asked me to look at initial priorities that might be capable of early action. And those were outlined in that interim report that I mentioned that was published in November last year. And the following things were beyond the scope of the review: the purpose of ADP and the adequacy of payments. And I have to say the adequacy of payments came up a lot, but as it was not in scope, I was not able to respond to some of the conversations that were had on that. They also asked me not to look at the wider aspects of disability assistance, so things that are not unique to ADP. And this was quite tricky. So, for example, things like supporting information, the special rules for terminal illness, those types of things that are not unique to ADP. And the reason that was quite challenging is because these are all parts of a client's experience, and therefore they came up naturally in the conversations that I was having. And I wasn't asked to consider whether there should be an alternative body to Social Security Scotland to deliver ADP. Briefly, in terms of the methodology, the most important thing to me as someone who has worked with and for disabled people almost my whole career, I wanted to make sure that the views and experiences of people with lived experience, either of a disability or a long-term health condition, and the organisations that support them really had a voice and were listened to throughout this review. And I think their input, hopefully you can see, is at the heart of the report. So we had a really comprehensive programme of engagement. I recruited an advisory group that consisted of 10 people that represented individuals with lived experience, and also some welfare advisors who were very knowledgeable about ADP and the social security system. There was a lot, I won't go through the whole list, but there was a lot of engagement sessions. I can't remember the number of meetings that I had, but it runs into hundreds. And we did an online public consultation and call for evidence that ran between June and August 2025. 2024. And I also met on multiple occasions with the Scottish Government, particularly members of the policy team and Social Security Scotland officials, to try and get a better understanding of the policy landscape and all the internal processes that have been shaping people's experience. And then the last thing to say is that there was a consultation I've already mentioned, I think, on the mobility component. But in addition to that, the Social Security Scotland also did an evaluation of supporting information. And both of those things were also part of my method, really, of collating information.
Thank you. I mean, I guess it's interesting to understand that you were restricted to some extent, and I guess the Cabinet Secretary would be wanting a degree of focus. I assume that that would be because of her intention to be able to act on your recommendations. Have you had any indication from Scottish Government when they will be able to respond to your recommendations?
Yes, it was set out quite clearly at the beginning of the review that there would be a response from ministers after or within 6 months of publication of my final report. So by my calculation, that would be by the 1st of February 2026 at the latest. And obviously I met with the Cabinet Secretary towards the end of the review and shared the final report with her. And she was certainly intending to stick to that deadline. And she will also, I think everyone is expecting the government's response to the recommendations to be made public.
And would you expect the government's response to be saying how they're going to deliver on your recommendations, or do you think it will be more finessed?
Gosh, I have no idea. I mean, I would hope, because you can see not just me, but the Secretariat and everybody else, particularly disabled people that have been involved in the review, you can see how much hard work has gone into it and how much evidence has been gathered. So I would certainly hope that the response would be quite robust in responding to the recommendations and saying whether or not, A, they intend to implement them, because there's 58, as you know, and they may decide to do none, a few or all, I have no idea. But I would certainly hope there would be some robust response. I think disabled people and others that have been involved in the review would expect that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I mean, when we took evidence from the Auditor General on the 1st of October, he said, "I do not think that we are yet clear about the government's intention around the review." Adele, are you reasonably clear about the government's intention around the review?
I'm certainly clear that they intend, as I say, to respond to the report and my recommendations within 6 months of publication. Obviously, I don't know what that response will be, whether it'll be a holding response, whether it'll be, we can implement some recommendations, but others will take more consideration or time. I really don't know what that will look like, but they've made a very public commitment. And as I say, less so about me and my expectations, but particularly the people who gave their time, shared some very personal stories and experiences with me. I think there's a high expectation among the disabled people's community in Scotland and welfare advisors and other key stakeholders and charities that the report will be published within 6 months of my report. Sorry, that the response will be published within 6 months of my report.
Yeah, thanks for that response. I'm going to now invite the Deputy Convener, Jamie Green, who's got some questions for you. Jamie.
Thank you, and good morning to you. Thank you very much for joining us. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to be the one that does talk about the money, being the Public Audit Committee, but I'll try and limit it to what's in your report and what we've already heard from Audit Scotland and what's in their report as well. But I thought I might link it to some of the comments you made in your opening statement to try and tease out some of the other issues which are not just financial but are very much linked to the finances of the delivery of this devolved benefit. Now, I won't state the obvious, but both reports do point out some of the sort of fiscal anomalies of the government in Scotland making or introducing different benefits of this nature. So I guess the first one really is just looking at that one snapshot financial year, the year 23-24. There was, of course, more spent than was received from the block grant, and that to the tune of £171 million. But looking ahead at the bigger picture, the forecast seems to suggest that by the year 2029, that could be as high as £700 or £800 million. Of course, the numbers will vary as we work through those years, but it's a substantial amount of money. And I guess my first question is, given that the Scottish Government has a mandatory duty to balance its books, have you identified any concerns that in order to meet this variance of spend versus what's received, that may affect other areas of the welfare, the wider welfare budget, or other social security benefits, and what effect that may have on other recipients, for example, of other benefits?
Yes, and I should sort of caveat any answer to do with the more financial related questions with you know, the fact that I recognise, obviously, that there's this gap in spending currently, and those forecasts are based on none of the recommendations in my review being implemented. That forecast is based just on the status quo, if you like. It also, as far as I understand, doesn't take into account any changes that might be made to the within the wider UK. Again, I'm really only focusing on the changes that might relate to PIP and how that might impact on the block grant funding for ADP. But of course, you could also argue the point that if the Scottish Government make any changes as a result of my review, then there's always also a reverse impact, if you like, on UK government in terms of funding. But we'll park that for now. But really, the caveat is I'm certainly not an expert in this area, but I will do my best to answer that question. So I'm not sure, first of all, I can add very much to Audit Scotland's findings on this, but you might have seen in my report that I quote the Fraser of Allender Institute, and they acknowledge that the caseload for disability benefits is growing right across the UK. So this is not just a Scottish issue. And it's rising more rapidly, however, in Scotland. And I think you heard from Audit Scotland on some of those reasons, although during the course of my review, it was very hard to really find evidence to determine what those reasons are. A lot of them are assumptions about things like the eligibility criteria remains broadly similar, but Scotland's system is seen obviously as much more accessible. It's got a simpler application and review process. And there's some very practical things that are different that come with a cost, like the awarding of short-term assistance, which is unique to Scotland, and investment in things like local delivery and the independent advocacy service. So these are all costs that are not being incurred like for like in the UK system. So I think my answer to the question really would be that if there's that gap of 770 million before any further changes or recommendations are implemented, that there would need to be a really comprehensive piece of work done if the Scottish Government do intend to implement any of my recommendations on what those additional costs over and above the 770 million might be. But as I said in my opening statement, as far as I know, in all these conversations we talk about cost, and I totally understand that, but no work is being proposed to look at what the potential wider economic benefits could be to Scotland or society, or the impact on other state-funded services if we actually invest in disability payments.
Thank you very much for that. Can I pick you up on something then you just said in the response to that, which I find very interesting, and that's that £770 million is, of course, based on a number of assumptions, but also is assuming the status quo continues for the next 5 years and doesn't take into account the government's response to any of your recommendations. The obvious question, therefore, would be, if in an ideal world, from your point of view, the government accepted and implemented all your recommendations, would that £770 million go up or down?
I can't give an accurate answer to that question because obviously some work would need to be done, but we can probably assume that when you start improving a system, that you will have one-off costs around things like case management system changes, and some of those are quoted in the report, very rough figures. For example, just for the case management system changes, I think the estimate was somewhere between 1.27 million and 2.9 million. So you could probably at this stage work out some numbers for some of the increased costs. Also, there's some examples in the report where recommendations relate to specific cohorts of people. So, for example, if one of the recommendations, for example, around automatic awarding of short-term assistance, so that would mean people don't have to apply for it. Obviously, there's a choice element here, but putting that aside, there'd be an automatic awarding of short-term assistance when people are going through redetermination and appeal. We've been able to put numbers on that as an illustrative kind of scenario in the report. So we can cost, or we can try to cost some things like automatic entitlement if someone is already in receipt of a blue badge for mobility, if they're already in receipt of independent living fund, for example. But the bigger cost implications, I think, would be around the benefit expenditure, because if you change the eligibility criteria, and if, there's a lot of ifs here, if the changes in the eligibility criteria result in a higher number of people being eligible, then obviously, you know, the cost is going to increase. But the reason I say if is because I don't think it necessarily follows that if you have a more modern human rights social model of disability outcomes focused way of measuring eligibility, and again there's some examples of this in the appendices in my report, I don't think it necessarily follows that that means more people are eligible. My argument would be these are people who are currently living with a disability or long-term health condition who find the current eligibility criteria and the application process is denying them and what is their human right. So it's very complex, and I think if the Scottish Government are intending on reviewing the eligibility criteria in the way I've recommended, that a lot of work by people much cleverer than me would need to be done, I think, on analysing those costs. But I think you could say there's a broad assumption that if you change eligibility criteria in the way that I've recommended, that the outcome would most likely be a higher cost.
I understand, and I'm not passing any judgment one way or the other on whether that's appropriate or not. However, I do draw attention to paragraph 40 of the Audit Scotland report around the Scottish Government's responsibilities under our Charter principle of delivering value for money. But more importantly, I think there was an interesting point made by the Auditor General around understanding that by taking a different approach to social security is what effect that has on other bits of the same budget, which also supports the same cohort of people, a bit in different ways, for example. But I think there's a whole other area, maybe for another day, where you could expand on that area of that actually you see these benefits as an investment, and in which ways they could bring down expenditure in other public services, for example. And I think that's probably quite a big and complex area of policy to look at, but an important one as well.
Yeah, and the words, obviously, value for money, I don't mean they mean different things in different circumstances, but I guess it does depend on how you look at it in the context of what we're discussing, because the policy intent, as I understand it, is that value for money is to be achieved not just through running a very efficient system, but also through the value it brings to society by reducing things like poverty and enabling people to live more independent lives. But the Scottish Government, as far as I'm aware, doesn't currently measure the success or otherwise of ADP in terms of poverty reduction or quality of life. So I'd suggest there is a gap there.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed for those answers, Adele. I'm now going to invite Colin Beattie to put some of his questions to you. Colin.
Thank you, Commissioner. Just one or two quick questions. In paragraphs 65 of the Auditor General's report, he indicated that the independent review found that they had a recurring theme in the feedback they'd received, disabled people highlighting the stress and anxiety it's caused by delays in the system. Now, your review notes frustrations from respondents with some of the processes adopted by Social Security Scotland, for example, the application process and processing times and lack of communication. Can you tell us a little bit more about which areas are causing the biggest issues and why?
Yes, certainly. So the less than positive issues that were raised by disabled people and other stakeholders generally related not to their overall experience, which, as I've already noted, is generally good, but rather to their frustrations. And frustrations in some of the stories I heard doesn't really go far enough. Some people did talk about trauma, but some of their frustrations with the processes that have been adopted by Social Security Scotland. And the ones that came up on a recurring basis were the application process itself, although it should be noted that the application form was designed with a lot of user testing and user input, and most people did say that it was an improvement on the application form for personal independence payment. However, it still was probably the biggest issue. So that's the application process, issues to do with technology, right through to the actual form itself and the way the questions are phrased. Other recurring themes were things like providing supporting information. That was a frustration in a lot of cases. Processing times came up consistently. Lack of communication. So once an application's made, not hearing for months or weeks the status of your application, and that causing a lot of anxiety. The telephone response times were mentioned. Issues with third-party mandates came up, but I'm aware that the agency is already doing something about that. Inconsistent decision-making. I think ADP is still a relatively new benefit, but those who work in the kind of welfare advice space are now collecting a lot of data and comparing decisions of different clients, and the issues of inconsistency in decision making came up a fair bit. And finally, the last few were around the lack of understanding of particular disabilities or conditions, and the fear of losing an award if you were considering a redetermination request. So those were the issues that came up the most that seemed to be adding to people's kind of anxiety about the whole process. And there was a lot of discussion around fluctuating conditions, and I think I've already mentioned accessible communication.
You know, the Auditor General highlighted that survey scores are positive overall, and this seems to align with your own consultation findings. But Audit Scotland also noted that it's not clear what levels the Scottish Government would regard as acceptable, or whether it expects better satisfaction scores than for PIP, given the different approach to ADP. Now, it suggests that Social Security Scotland should consider setting such a level as part of its evaluation work and include results around dignity, fairness and respect in their public performance indicators, measuring success in that. Do you agree with that?
Yes, it would certainly, well, it certainly makes sense to me that if you are holding so much store by treating people with dignity, fairness and respect, that you would want to understand whether you were meeting those aspirations in the majority, if not all client experiences. And as you say, the general customer client survey results, and there's lots of them quoted in my report, are reasonable and good in a lot of cases. But I don't have the page right in front of me at the moment, but there are some areas. So, for example, I've talked about accessible communication, where if you look at a client survey of people who've got communication needs, those percentages drop quite significantly. I think the satisfaction score was sitting at around 30%. So I think I would agree in as much as, if we want to see positive change, we all know that the things that get measured and reported on are the things that we focus on in terms of culture and behaviours. So if a lot of store is being put against those values and those principles, then we should find some way of measuring them. Although, as I say, overall, during the course of my review, I would say that the majority of people I spoke to and engaged with, when they compared the PIP process with ADP, they did feel that they'd been treated in a very person-centred way, that people were kind, and they spoke positively about the staff interactions.
Well, that's really good to hear. I suppose the problem is when you're talking about aspects of like dignity, fairness and respect, they're very subjective. And it's difficult to measure. I mean, yes, you get your response to your questionnaires and so on. You get your assessments, but how do you actually evaluate this in a way that is positive for Social Security Scotland to put changes into place in response to that?
I mean, I would agree with that to a point. I think dignity and respect probably are easier to measure if you're clear about obviously how you're going to do that than with the word in the middle around fairness, because that is very subjective. And interestingly, again, there's a section on this in my report. When we were looking at alternatives to a points-based system for making an award, because generally points-based systems are seen as not being very dignified and not in line with that kind of social model of disability or human rights approach. We couldn't, I couldn't find an alternative, and I did look, and we had lots of engagement sessions on this to see, because it was universally disliked, was there an alternative? But ultimately what that came down to, and the reason I'm using it as an example, was fairness, because the number of disabled people and welfare advisors were saying, you know, if you don't have some form of measurement, how can you challenge the fairness of a decision? So I think there's probably ways that you can measure how people are treated. I think the fairness point is probably more complex. Someone did say to me during the course of the review that, of course, you could have two decisions, two different decisions, and they could both be right, which blew my mind for a little while until I stopped and thought about it. But as soon as you bring human decision-making and probability and all of these things into a decision-making process, then at times it may not appear to be fair for everyone. And that's one of the challenges, I think, in the whole system.
And just one last question. Given the Auditor General's comment that the Scottish Government lacks a clear framework to assess ADP's overall impact, how might your review's recommendations support the development of such an evaluation strategy?
I think the overall evaluation is really important. I touched on this. I don't think I addressed it directly, but I touched on it in the context of the purpose of ADP. If the purpose of ADP is to support disabled people with the additional costs of having a disability, then I think there's a gap in that there's no evidence of how people are spending the money, what they're spending the money on. Indeed, if it is helping to reduce poverty and to promote independence and well-being. So I think if you're going to start from you're looking at an evaluation, some of those things that I've hinted at in the report would be relevant. But I think at the moment, because it's still, as I say, a relatively new disability payment, I think there's probably some other sort of more fundamental things that we should be measuring and evaluating before we start looking at that bigger picture. And to be really clear as well, because I'm very conscious that I'm here representing lots of voices and lots of different people who had lots of different opinions on things. There were also quite a body of disabled people who had quite an adverse reaction to any sort of measurement of how they were spending their adult disability payment. They felt quite a real reaction to the suggestion that might ever be part of an evaluation, because obviously that's about that's about choice and privacy and, again, dignity.
Thank you. Mira.
Okay, thank you. We've now got a couple of questions from a member of the committee, Graham Simpson. Graham, over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much. Adele, I just want to follow up on what you were saying there around about eligibility and whether we actually monitor whether this payment actually improves people's lives or not. You seem to be saying that we don't, there is no data on that, so we don't know what difference it's made to people, if any. Do you not think that there should be some research into that?
Yeah, there is some research. Again, in my experience of doing the review, there was limited research on, for example, the additional costs of living with a disability. Again, I don't have the page in front of me, but I think I quote from some work that was done by the charity Scope on trying to assess what those additional costs might be. And this does sort of take us into that adequacy of payment conversation, which was definitely out of scope of my review. So we do have some evidence on what those additional costs, not at an individual level, but at a sort of collective level, what those additional costs of living with a disability might be. But in my interim report, I did actually make a recommendation or an observation that further research should be done so that we have a much better idea of what those additional costs might be. But as far as I am aware, we don't currently collect any data, and I don't think the DWP do either. And this is probably back to the principle of this being a human right. I mean, no one would ask you or I how we spend our money and how we choose to spend our money, whether we're disabled or not. So there was quite a reaction when that was suggested that it could be part of an evaluation or a way of measuring the effectiveness of ADP. So I think it would be quite complicated to do, but as far as I'm aware, that we don't collect that data at the moment. Okay. Or I say we, Scotland doesn't collect that data at the moment.
Right. You say in the foreword to your report that you are, quotes, concerned with how the changes at UK level may impact disabled people in Scotland, especially in relation to how people in receipt of certain rates of adult disability payment may be entitled to other benefits. Can you expand on that?
Yes. So obviously, at the time of writing the report, the UK government had produced their green paper, and then pretty quickly afterwards, as we will all recall, some of that was reversed, if that's the right word. And Sir Stephen Timms announced his review of the PIP assessment that I think is due to report in autumn 26. Just to note, I have met with Sir Stephen Timms on several occasions during the course of the review and more recently to share the findings of my review and to advise on the methodology that was used in Scotland to ensure a genuinely inclusive process. But yeah, I'm most concerned with how the changes at the UK level might impact on disabled people in Scotland. And this is particularly in relation to where people are entitled to other benefits as a result of receiving a certain level of adult disability payment. So this is referred to as passporting or passported benefits. And there's a big fear, I think, around the disabled people's community about this at the moment, because although the Timms review, again, as I understand it, I'm certainly not an expert on the Timms review, but as I understand it, they are looking at personal independence payment, but they're not looking at the potential impact of the removal of the work capability assessment, which is being debated or discussed for universal credit, and they're not looking at the linking of the universal credit health element to the PIP assessment. So again, not being an expert in the detail of this, and probably for the committee you don't need the detail, but decisions that are taken at UK government level, not just related to PIP, but related to that wider welfare reform, could definitely impact on the lives of disabled people in Scotland. Equally, if any of my recommendations were implemented, particularly those around the eligibility criteria, then that might impact on both governments' conversations about block grant funding. Because if we do anything in Scotland that increases the number of people that are eligible, for example, then that we wouldn't necessarily as a country receive the increased cost through the block grant.
Which is a very topical subject indeed. You also say
on that.
yes. You also say the number of people receiving adult disability payment is forecast to grow from 379,000 in 24-25 to, I had to pinch myself when I read this, 703,000 in 2030-31. And according to the Scottish Fiscal Commission, that would see the cost rise from 3.1 billion to 5.4 billion. I mean, those are huge sums, and presume that would get bigger if your recommendations were followed. So surely all this is becoming rather unsustainable, isn't it?
Well, as I said a moment ago, there would potentially be one-off costs if some of my recommendations were implemented, particularly those that are either to do with one-off costs such as additional training or systems changes, for example. And there could be additional costs if we look at some policy changes, for example, the one I quoted earlier about automatically awarding short-term assistance, for example. But I don't think it necessarily follows that if you have activities and descriptors that just better reflect people's real lives and are modernised, because the current system, in my view, it doesn't reflect modern day life. And if we looked more at outcomes rather than activities, if all of those changes were made as I am suggesting, it doesn't necessarily follow that more people will be eligible. It just means we've got a fairer, in my view, and more realistic way of measuring that eligibility.
Yeah, but the figures are quoted are from your report.
Yes, I know. But those figures of the increase is just looking at the ones that are quoted are just looking at the status quo. The very final part of my report goes through where it was possible to try and put some numbers on some of the recommendations, but noting that it's an incredibly difficult thing to do at the moment, estimating change in benefit expenditure as a result of implementing any of the recommendations, because we just don't have the data that we would need to make those calculations at the moment. So the figures that are quoted are just looking at the numbers that are expected to rise in terms of caseload, irrespective of whether any of my recommendations are taken into account or not.
But you did tell us earlier that if the government followed your recommendations, it would cost more.
Yes, I think on the balance of probabilities it would. I just don't have those numbers to hand. But I suppose the point I'm making is that there would definitely be some one-off costs that would be incurred if some of the recommendations were implemented around things like systems changes and improvement to training and, those sorts of things. There would also be some additional costs if some of the policy changes that I'm recommending were made. For example, automatic entitlement for people who are in receipt of a blue badge or already in receipt of independent living fund. But the biggest, I suppose, piece of this in terms of cost would be if benefit expenditure increased as a result of changes to eligibility. And I don't think it necessarily follows that if you make a system more modern, more outcomes focused, better reflective of people's real lives, taking into account things like fluctuating conditions, it doesn't necessarily follow that more people will be eligible, therefore the benefit expenditure would go up. It would be determined very much by what that new set of eligibility criteria looks like. Hopefully that explains it. I mean, on the balance of probability, you would have to argue that more people might be eligible, therefore the cost would go up. But that work hasn't been done yet.
That's the way it looks to me. But I'll ask you something else. Just one final question. Again, from the report, it highlights the need for a more person-centred and trauma-informed approach to ADP. What specific changes do you think Social Security Scotland should implement to achieve this?
Again, there's a number of recommendations in the report, particularly in the section about processes at work and being a learning organisation. One where building on the good foundations that I say are already there. I can't stress enough how much people compared the ADP process to the PIP process and how they did feel it was much kinder in nature. And I've already said in this meeting, you know, the things that cause frustration and cause stress. But the word trauma was used often actually when describing their experiences of being assessed for PIP. So things like not having the medical assessments as part of the Scottish system has been welcomed. But although the agency started to do some work around trauma-informed practice, in my view, having spoken to agency colleagues and obviously gathering the evidence and the information and stories from disabled people themselves, I think there is more that could be done to ensure that when clients are engaging with Social Security Scotland, that there is an awareness of trauma, not just from the experience, but trauma that people might have experienced in their life. And so one of the recommendations in my report does ask that the agency does more in that regard.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Adele. Just a couple of final questions from me. My first one relates to something you were speaking to Graham Simpson about, not in the last set of questions, but in the ones before that, because there is an argument which is paraded in Scotland that reforms or even the removal of personal independence payment in England and Wales has no effect in Scotland because we've got adult disability payment. But I think, as you've explained to us, reforms to PIP will have an implication for Scotland because, A, of the passporting issue that you've identified, B, because of the Barnett consequentials, which would be potentially resulting from reforms to PIP, and C, because of the way the fiscal framework operates. In other words, if the benefit bill in Scotland goes up, the financial settlement that comes through the formula goes down. So, I mean, can you confirm on the record that it is your view that there is a direct relationship between what happens with the Sir Stephen Timms review and what the consequences will be for recipients of adult disability payment in Scotland?
Yeah, obviously, without knowing what the outcome of the Sir Stephen Timms review is, it's difficult to answer with any great deal of certainty. But if there are any changes to personal independence payment, that might impact on the funding. That, you know, for argument's sake, let's say at the end of the PIP review, there is some overall reduction in spend. Although I have to say, when I last met Sir Stephen Timms, he was clear that the review wasn't a cost-cutting exercise. His view was that wasn't any additional money to be found, but that this wasn't a cost-cutting exercise, and I suppose we should take him at his word. But obviously, if there are any changes, that will impact on the block grant funding at that kind of higher level. But I think most disabled people that I spoke to, the thing that they were most concerned about or fearful of was the issue around passporting, which I've already said. So there are some proposals to look at universal credit and linking the health element to the PIP assessment. So at the moment, that would be linked to the ADP assessment. But obviously, if there are any changes, that could have an impact on people's financial income. And also the issue around the work capability assessment, which again, overall, when you look at someone's benefit income, some of it at the moment comes via adult disability payment, but some of it comes from benefits that are not devolved to Scotland. And so there is, of course, a risk that some of the changes, either in Scotland or at UK level, could impact on the overall amount of money that someone receives.
Okay, thank you. Can I ask you another question to get your response on the record, which is you have, of course, read the Audit Scotland report on adult disability payment. Do you agree with the recommendations which are made in that report?
Yes, I do, and although we were carrying out our reviews at broadly the same time, and we did meet on a couple of occasions, obviously the scope and the focus of the two reviews were quite different. But I do agree with them all. I note, of course, or should stress that they refer to the current system. And so if there were any fundamental changes following my review, that Audit Scotland may need or want to repeat their process, because obviously their recommendations are based on the here and now. But yes, I do agree with all their recommendations. They make good sense, and as I say, most of their recommendations are things that were out of scope of my review. So it's good to take the two reports together.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And my final question is, you've alluded already to the fact that your report makes 58 recommendations across a range of areas, albeit not quite a bigger range as you might have liked to have made recommendations. But nonetheless, 58 recommendations represents a lot. Do you have a view about which should be the priorities for the Scottish Government, both in the short, medium and long term, which, if they were to, by February of next year, or hopefully even before, but if by February next year they said that we accept the recommendations of Adele Harris's independent review on adult disability payment, if you were in their shoes, which ones would you look to accelerate and implement in the short term, which might be more medium and longer term ones?
Yeah, there's several recommendations. I know there's a lot, but there's several that could be implemented relatively easily, in my view, with no implications for recurring costs. And those smaller things would enhance the client experience. So I would hope that they would be received positively. However, if I had to prioritise overall, and it is a tricky thing to sort of do, really, because obviously I think all of the recommendations are important. But I think I would highlight the recommendations in the Better Future part of the report, because if Scotland continues to operate within the personal independence payment framework, although we can make it a more dignified and compassionate process, we're not really fundamentally changing anything. And we wouldn't, in my view, be meeting the aspirations that are set out in the legislation or the Charter. And I really think this is an opportunity in time. It's a really big opportunity to design a world-leading, holistic, person-centred disability payment system that is supportive of disabled people's needs. And if I was pressed further and I could only choose two out of that Better Future part of the report, the overwhelming kind of response to the review and all the engagement and conversations I had, the two would be removing reference to a fixed distance in assessing mobility, and the second one would be replacing the 50% rule with an improved application of the reliability criteria.
Thanks very much indeed for that clarity, and thanks for concluding this session with a very hopeful, visionary message of a better future that we could see. Can I thank you very much indeed, Adele Harris, for your time this morning. Your evidence has been really useful for us. We've got a session with the Scottish Government and Social Security Scotland coming up very soon. I don't know whether we'll take the opportunity to try and press them to get a response from them earlier than February of what their view is about the recommendations which you've made in your very important report. So we will make sure you're aware of when that evidence session is, so that you can tune in if you're not able to follow it later on. But can I thank you, Adele Harris, for your time. We're very grateful, and I am now going to move this morning's committee meeting into private session.